Distinguished professors, dear colleagues, dear students, ladies and gentlemen, it is an honor and a privilege for me to be able to communicate with you thanks to remote conference technology. Even as we go through the most challenging times most of us have ever faced in our lifetimes, the very fact that I can send you this contribution to be web streamed across the internet illustrates the commitment of the FITISPOS group to addressing challenges head-on, even in the midst of a global pandemic. What could be more inspiring at this time than continuing to provide lifelong learning opportunities for all, as proclaimed within the objectives of the United Nations 2030 Agenda, aiming to bring us closer to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. Indeed, I pay special tribute to the authorities at the University of Alcalá, who, despite the fact that everything we know about daily life and normal activities is disrupted, remain determined to do everything possible to work together with the presenters and all of you who have made the decision to participate and elaborate on this theme of the human factor in public service interpretation and translation, PSIT. My sincere thanks go to the organizers who, often beyond the call of duty, have made this event possible. I speak to you from Addis Ababa in Ethiopia, over 8,000 kilometers away from Madrid. Being able to communicate this message to you today is a tangible illustration of what it means to be so connected to each other in this digital age. We are living witnesses to the speed of interconnectivity, and we are beginning to measure just how bound together we all are by the ties of global trade and supply chains, for good and for ill. As language professionals, though, we have known for a long time the determining role we have played and continue to play in bringing human beings from all backgrounds and geographical spaces together, making it possible for us to connect with each other and not be blocked by differences in language and culture. I speak to you as an interpreter trainer who has worked in the development business for several decades now. Allow me to take some of your time today to share some of my experiences, professional experiences that are related to our interest in multiculturalism and multilingualism in the broad sense. And I particularly wish to share with you my own personal experience of training interpreters and translators in Africa to meet the emerging needs of our communities. This presentation is an attempt to connect my personal experience with my professional work, implementing some of the policies promoting sustainable development. You are familiar with these development policies as laid down by the United Nations and its 17 Sustainable Development Goals. We are all slowly beginning to understand how the successful implementation of these policies and statements that often seem far removed from our daily realities, but are, in fact, dependent on our own small actions every day in the field. Our personal work with our communities, in our institutions. Today, Through participating in this conference, we are contributing to Sustainable Development Goal number 4 for education, SDG 4, right here, through this major institution of learning dating back to the 13th century, Universidad de Alcalá de Henares. I pay tribute to the way through the 7th International Conference and the ones that have preceded it. This university regularly uses the technologies and digital interconnectedness of the modern era to enrich upon the knowledge systems that have contributed to build up its own solid foundations. In this presentation, illustrating how languages are put to work for community development, I shall begin with a brief overview of the institutional context for various modes of interpretation in the world of development and poverty reduction. This is more of a practical overview, drawing on my own personal journey as a freelance interpreter working within traditional conference settings in the multilateral finance and development arenas. I shall then present a practical interpretation and translation training approach based on a brief evaluation of a pioneer, multi-regional, intra-university project that aims to improve the quality of language professionals serving state and non-state actors in Africa and beyond. In the third and final part of this paper, I shall explore avenues for research into public service interpretation and practice firmly grounded in the realities of practitioners who are forging new paths to reach those who are so often left behind. My focus, for the purpose of illustration on this third and final part, will be on the deaf in selected African communities. Ladies and gentlemen, Africa is a continent with a diversity of over 2,000 languages. Most citizens in African countries are de facto bilingual or even multilingual, using both mother tongue and one or more languages used in their communities before the age of 5. Those who are lucky enough to continue on to formal education benefit from the continuous interaction in their homes and their communities of both local African, imported Arabic, and European languages. One of the key linguistic features of the African continent, following its politico-administrative segmentation by the Berlin Conference in 1884, is that English-speaking countries may have French-speaking countries on all of their land borders. I give you the example of my country, Nigeria, in West Africa. Portuguese-speaking countries may have all English-speaking neighbors. The example that comes to mind is Mozambique in southern Africa. Now, for we language professionals, this means that we may find ourselves competing with thousands of people from border regions who also speak a multiplicity of so-called official languages. This is where training and institutional standards can make all the difference. Let me give an example to illustrate this point. The Lake Chad Basin Commission, headquartered in N'Djamena, in Chad, uses English and French as its official languages. This commission serves 2 francophone, 1 anglophone, and 1 officially bilingual country. The member states are Cameroon, Chad, Niger, and Nigeria. It has in fact since expanded to include the Central African Republic, another neighbor with its borders on Lake Chad. The Commission recruits professional conference interpreters and trained translators for its annual summit meetings and to work with the experts in its natural resource development programs. The same applies to the Niger Basin Authority, headquartered in Niamey, capital of Niger, producing documents and organizing meetings in French and English for 9 member countries, only 2 of which are English-speaking, Cameroon and Nigeria. In Africa, the institutional heart of development policy making for the continent is arguably located right here in Addis, at the headquarters of the African Union Commission. A brief reminder, it was with the Organization of African Unity, established in May 1963 by 37 independent and sovereign states, that I began my career on the continent as a freelance conference interpreter. The OAU, the Organization of African Unity, as it was at the time, was the institutional incarnation of the tradition of Pan-Africanism. It was also the administrative setting for permanent employment for conference interpreters from all over Africa. We were the language professionals who participated in momentous events that were to determine the economic and political future of many nations following the heady days of African independence in the 60s. The institutional successor to the OAU, the African Union, AU, now a regional organization of 55 member states, came into being in May 2001. The official languages of the Union and all its institutions were Arabic, English, French, Portuguese, and, yes, Spanish. Of course, as you know, the prominence of Arabic in many African countries is due to the Arabization of local African populations from the 7th century, whilst European languages were introduced during the period of European colonialism on the continent. In addition to those languages that had been imported to the continent and became official languages of the newly independent African bureaucracies, the African Union declared that Kiswahili and any other African language were to be put to official use for its operations. Let me give another example of what this meant in practice. During the opening of the African Union Heads of State and Government Summit in July 2004, the outgoing chairperson, President Joaquim Chissano of Mozambique, made his speech in Kiswahili. A non-native speaker of Kiswahili, his stated intention was to promote African identity and languages. There were no conference interpreters with Kiswahili in their language combinations hired for that event, and this took the AU Commission by surprise, as you can well imagine. However, this sparked even more discussions on the use of living African languages, as opposed to imported languages of the former colonial rulers. Kiswahili, I need not remind you, is the official language of Tanzania, Uganda, and Kenya. It is compulsory in schools and also taught at university. An estimated 100 million people in East Africa speak this Bantu language. Spoken by over half of the population in just one country, the Democratic Republic of Congo, DRC, with an estimated 86 million inhabitants in 2019, you can see how the official use of Kiswahili is, in fact, an instrument for linguistic unity in the entire region. It transcends the colonial boundaries of Francophone countries such as the DRC, Anglophone countries like Uganda, its neighbor, and further south, a Lusophone Portuguese-speaking country, Mozambique. What I am driving at is that the Multilingual African Union Commission is, therefore, one of the institutional hubs on the continent for interpretation and translation. Institutions take a long time to be established and have to be given time to grow and become centers of reference. Beginning with the OAU's creation of its African Economic Community, with a treaty that entered into force in 1994, the AEC, the African Economic Community, is a geopolitical framework for the integration of African economies. Treaty institutions are the Economic and Social Commission, the Pan-African Parliament, and the Court of Justice. Each of these bodies provides constant work for English and French freelance interpreters, with Portuguese interpreters on staff at the Parliament since 2016. These institutions also closely work with the universities throughout the world that train interpreters and translators. They have entered into memoranda of understanding for taking interns for master's programs in these universities. These young professionals are given exposure and integrated into transcontinental networks. Interns from your TISP master's program are welcome to come and explore these opportunities. You may wonder why I am speaking to you about conference interpretation and translation. Well, this is because within the multilateral world of development policies, and we are, after all, talking about sustainable development goals, simultaneous interpretation and translation from and into the 6 official working languages of the United Nations is the order of the day. It was only logical, therefore, that when the United Nations Economic and Social Council set up its 5 regional commissions stationed in 5 regions across the world to promote regional development, these were the bodies that would provide both simultaneous and consecutive interpretation for their meetings to the same international standards as at headquarters in New York. That is why the same practice followed in the African institutions for development and poverty reduction. I'm thinking, for example, of the African Development Bank, AFDB, which came into being in 1964 and was initially conceptualized at the request of African member states by the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, UNECA. The AFDB, the African Development Bank, the first multilateral development finance institution in Africa, headquartered in Abidjan, Côte d'Ivoire, in West Africa, is now made up of 53 regional member countries and 24 non-regional member countries. Countries from all over the world. For language professionals, the AFDB serves as the largest hub in West Africa for the recruitment of freelance interpreters, since its business is conducted in the official working languages of English and French, with Arabic and Portuguese used on occasion. In 2018, the bank group ranked as the 4th best company to work for in Africa out of 100 corporate and multilateral organizations, according to a study to which I refer in my paper. No doubt, the full-time interpretation and translation staff who work there, and where I began my career as a staff interpreter, will not disagree. From the angle of translation, The AFDB's 2018 African Economic Outlook, a report published annually in English, French, and Portuguese, is a reference work on macroeconomic development and infrastructure that now has highlights available in 3 of the most widely read and spoken languages in Africa: Arabic, Hausa, and Kiswahili. Now, to communicate with you a little bit more about why there was initially such an institutional focus on conference interpretation and translation services provision in Africa, I shall ask you to do a little research yourselves about Pan-African institutional frameworks. We have the Common Market for Eastern and Southern Africa, and there the official languages are English, French, and Portuguese. And then we have the regional economic communities, 8 of them. And all of these entities report to the African Union's heads of state and government. They use professional interpretation and translation to implement their activities to facilitate regional economic trade. They are the ones who are promoting the free movement of people, services, goods, and capital. Well, from the Lagos Plan of Action, where these policies were initially laid out for the development of Africa in 1980, to the recent adoption of the African Continental Free Trade Area just last March in Kigali, Rwanda, conference interpreters have been present in the booths, prepared with all the vocabulary, terminology, information, and background knowledge on the policy areas of concern, using their language skills in French, English, Arabic, and Portuguese to ensure error-free communication. Well, this is an institutional architecture. These multilateral and multi-regional bodies and agencies that are the key fora for conference interpretation and translation on the continent. I call them our trees. The institutional architecture served by interpretation and translation training programs at the master's level, training programs that supply quality language professionals to these bodies. And this brings me to the second part of my presentation, where I wish to give a brief overview of the academic setting for interpretation and translation training in Africa. The first interpreter training establishment was set up by the officially bilingual French and English government of Cameroon in 1985. The Advanced School of Translators and Interpreters, ASTI, at Buea in Cameroon. This was the only public higher education institution in Africa training translators and interpreters for the public and private sectors, for civil service, and for international organizations. It was granted university status in 1993, and the Masters of Arts programs in both translation and interpretation at ASTI is conducted over a 2-year period, with teaching staff coming mainly from amongst the professional interpreters in national institutions. ASTI has partnership agreements with the universities of Quebec, Ottawa, and Kigali in Rwanda. ASTI also offers courses on economics, law, and international organizations, important components, as you know, of any training program for interpreters and translators. It was in the early 2000s that people who work with professional interpreters began to realize that staff interpreters at the UN, for example, were aging. Students from developing countries were finding it increasingly difficult to get government scholarships, as the public higher education systems in their countries felt the brunt of structural adjustment programs and a renewed focus on funding basic primary education. Over time, fewer and fewer postgraduate students would get visas even to attend training institutions in Europe and the Americas. So new avenues for professional language skills development at the tertiary level on the African continent had to be explored. You may have heard of the Gigiri Declaration adopted at the United Nations Office at Nairobi, UNON, in 2009. It called for the creation of the Pan-African Masters in Conference Interpretation, PSIT. And this led to the launch of an MA training program in June 2016. Let me quickly tell you about the PSIT group. Initially, 6 universities representing and serving the 5 main geographic and linguistic configurations of the African continent made up the PSIT core group. There was ASTI, to which I have already referred, at the University of Buea in Cameroon. There was the Center for Translation and Interpretation at the University of Nairobi, Kenya. There was the University of Ghana in Accra, the Universidad Pedagógica de Mozambique in Maputo, Mozambique, and also initially the faculty of Al-Alsun of Ain Shams University in Cairo. Vice-chancellors from each of the consortium universities signed memoranda of understanding, and these became the legal framework of cooperation. Gaston Berger University of Saint Louis, Senegal, in West Africa, representing Francophone countries, became a consortium member in 2015. The Arabic language faculty of Al-Alsun, Ain Shams University, initially serving northern regions of Africa within the consortium, did not adopt the proposed curriculum and are not members at this present stage. PSIT brings students, trainers, language professionals, academics, and researchers together in a professional network. The goal of the consortium and its members, supported for the first 3 years by co-funding from the European Union and UNON, is improved conditions for quality training of interpreters and translators in Africa. To benefit from project funding, universities were asked to adopt curricula adapted from the European Masters in Interpretation and Translation. Of course, higher education systems and policies in Africa are not uniform. Academic calendars are not identical. Therefore, shortly after program commencement, a curriculum harmonization exercise was completed by PSIT to streamline teaching content, share training principles, produce a basic reference bibliography, and guidelines on internships. By the end of 2019, on completion of project funding, 77 Masters in Translation students and 58 Masters in Interpretation students graduated from these 5 universities, and one of them was an additional confirmed PhD in Translation Studies, who all entered the job market, thus helping to mitigate shortages of trained and skilled language professionals on the African market. Graduates from these universities now work with major regional organizations, or the trees, as I have called them in the first part of this presentation. Institutions such as the African Development Bank, ECOWAS, the African Union, the Pan-African Parliament, the United Nations Secretariat in New York, the West African Meteorological Organization, and the African, Caribbean, and Pacific States Secretariat have all provided openings to these graduates, many of whom also work in NGOs and private sector translation agencies. This PSIT project is an illustration of how expanding partnerships leads to the production of language practitioners who prove themselves to be, and I quote, well-trained professionals with a sense of duty and a desire to contribute their fair share to the development of the continent. Well, ladies and gentlemen, there remains a huge demand for skilled language professionals to work in the institutions and agencies that I have presented to you. as the trees that make up the multilateral and multilingual platforms for knowledge management and data sharing in the development world. This world of international conferences, seminars, and workshops does indeed rely on the supply of skilled interpreters and translators. So that is why the members of the PSIT consortium, these 5 universities, have resolved to continue with their own resources and willing partners to provide sustainable funding for their master's programs. So you can get trained on the African continent now, and you, through these trainers who are practicing professionals, through the virtual training programs that these universities offer, you can become a skilled language professional for the trees. Now that e-learning has been adopted as an instructional tool, in addition to the other modes of instruction, universities are learning from each other. And this is making tertiary education more cost-effective and accessible. And when I say learning from each other, what I mean is learning from each other's strategies to tap into ICT, information communications technology. So they are expanding their partnerships. Furthermore, the newly qualified postgraduate conference interpreters and translators can prepare for the United Nations language competitive examinations, and they receive professional exposure to the United Nations family. These are also the lessons that have been learned from the PSIT program, lessons that can guide future regional programs planning to increase the access to conference interpreting and translation. These are skills that we hope will lead to graduates organizing professional associations in their countries, and which will help to establish the ethical rules and standards to govern their markets and deliver better services to customers. I'm sure you may have read somewhere that on the African continent, the interpreter, alongside the village headmaster, back in the day, was in a position of power as a spokesperson for the local colonial authority of the day. This may provide one explanation as to why conference interpretation was traditionally a male-dominated profession. Now, increased access to higher education for girls in Africa means that more and more female students are embracing this career path. And as well as you know, when we move into public service, interpretation and translation, we are moving closer to the caring professions, the nurturing professions, the professions where women excel. Now, we have entered the final decade of the UN 2030 agenda. Last month, I participated in a meeting of high-level policymakers whose prime objective is to speed up policy implementation and data collection efforts to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. They have vowed to implement urgent initiatives, such as what they call the SDG acceleration actions, to propel the implementation of these policies forward and to pool resources and share technological advances. But as you will agree with me, implementing these activities also depends, successfully implementing these activities also depends on clear and undistorted channels of communication, working with language professionals at all levels of engagement. At that SDG conference, reflecting United Nations principles for a more inclusive approach to the work that we are doing, were sign language interpreters hard at work. Along with the conference interpreters present, including myself, at that meeting, they also represented the supply side of skilled language experts whose services are offered to the partners on the demand side, the groups and stakeholders who bring their consultative and participatory input to development programs. So in recognition of this, the PSIT training program, which I have briefly described to you in the second part of this presentation, also envisages a third pillar, public service interpreting. First and foremost, in order to operationalize this area of training, it is understood that African languages need to be integrated into these translation and interpretation master's programs. The University of Nairobi, for example, offers Swahili, of course, an official language, as I had said at the beginning, in many East African countries. But there's a general recognition that we need to work together within our universities to enhance the status of African languages as languages of regional communication and integration. This goes hand in hand with professionalizing services of community service interpreting, public service interpreting, court and police interpreting, thus catering to the growing needs in African countries for these services and in Europe in the wake of the migration crisis. So, the public and community aspect of multicultural communication is a living, everyday reality in societies where, as we have been reminded, Africans think and interact in many languages. We have a treasure trove in the generation of Africans now in their late 80s who, as they pass on, may be taking with them valuable knowledge. It is up to us to study these languages. It is up to us, as the African Union declared in 2006, the Year of African Languages, to step up efforts to safeguard any of these languages that may be on the verge of extinction. Such discussions on cross-cultural communication clearly note, discussions in the AU and elsewhere, clearly note that Africa must leverage local languages to promote access to information in local communities. This will mean an increase in access to public services, such as in the justice and health sectors, working towards respecting basic rights in these communities. Let me mention one of these very underserved communities in more detail, briefly. I am thinking of a particularly underserved and overlooked group of people, the deaf. Kenya reports approximately 2.2 million deafened or hard of hearing persons. In Tanzania, they are an estimated 1 million. Now, depending on the information source, there are only 5 or maximum 10 sign language interpreters employed by the Tanzanian government. These interpreters work in universities and in vocational education institutions, and they are only employed, according to the Tanzanian Association of the Deaf, because there's a constitutional requirement that deaf people's rights should be respected. In Kenya, there are 15 sign language interpreters. Well, in the medical setting in Africa, doctors are working on establishing sign language units at hospitals in Burkina Faso, Cameroon, and Tunisia. These are particularly of acute need now as we look at the present public health communication challenges and the difficulties reaching the underserved communities with the information that may be life-saving. The Kenya Sign Language Research Project is working on the development of a sign language curriculum. Yet, the lack of accredited training programs is a contributing factor to low standards in sign language interpretation, which leads directly to a demeaning view of deaf persons, which in turn fuels the abuse of the human rights of the deaf community. Participants to this conference may wish to reflect on new avenues of research about the sign language interpretation situation in Spain and share opinions on the effects on community interpreting, for example, legal and health care settings, as well as the related social justice issues. Collaborative research possibilities with African universities do exist, and the development of vocabulary, standardization of sign language, the rights of the deaf, human rights for deaf people, as well as including sign language in all aspects of life. Well, that was my brief illustration of a particularly underserved community that we wish to reach out to as we stress the growing recognition that community interpreters and translators need to be trained and equipped not only as language mediators, but also as protectors, negotiators, diplomats who understand local cultures. To my mind, they represent a forest, providing incalculable oxygen to the rest of our societies. Many organizations, ranging from multilateral financial institutions such as the AFDB to humanitarian organizations such as those working in the refugee camps in Somalia or in northern Kenya, are already standing under the trees that I referred to, those institutional platforms that are our regional development bodies, and the few interpretation and translating programs that provide them with quality service delivery to do their work. But approximately 30% of the world's land area is estimated to be covered by forests. Balancing the economic value of the forests against the need to preserve the huge range of biodiversity they represent is going to occupy our species for decades to come. If you accept my analogy, that where we have concentrated on conference interpretation training in academic centers for these international regional development finance institutions, we have tended the indigenous tree species, these multilateral Pan-African institutions. I put it to you that the lessons learned about the economic value of, say, mahogany or rosewood or the many palm trees we have planted through the graduates, these interpretation and translation graduates going out to contribute their skills to development, must now be applied to increasing local language and public interpretation skills development to serve our communities who represent, in my analogy, our forests. Let us not lose sight of the forests for the trees. Let us all work together, integrating these isolated activities in selected academic institutions into a concerted response to train interpretation and translation actors for quality-based service delivery in our communities through supporting PSIT training. I look forward to increased cooperation with universities such as Alcalá to contribute to the development of the appropriate curricula based on a knowledge base informed by African sociocultural realities. In conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, let me thank you for this opportunity to share a few of my experiences and to learn from you about the best that you give to your communities. By so doing, we are contributing to the current debate about inclusive development in Africa. And we have 10 years to achieve our stated goals. Thank you, and stay safe.